So why don't we get started? Um, Thanks so much for being here, everyone. My name is Carl Hammond Lipscomb. I'm the director of Envision Freedom Fund. And as many of you know, Envision Freedom Fund has been working to end bail and pretrial detention for nearly a decade now. And with this project in particular, we've been talking about it for a couple of years, beginning in 2020 when we saw the first round of rollbacks to bail reform. Since then, the tough on crime rhetoric from the media, law enforcement, and more recently our elected officials has come to dominate the narrative around safety in New York City, leading to the governor's most recent push to further chip away at bail reform. Um, you know, this rhetoric has also had residual effects on other areas of in the criminal justice system, such as the raise the age law, discovery reform, gun laws, and more. Um, so we set out to do this project, and we've sort of called this our public opinion research project, which the folks at Goodwin Simon will explain a bit more. But we found ourselves very much so in the defensive, definitely from the perspective of the narrative and communications, but also on the policy front, meaning that every time, the law enforcement or the police union would put something out that was false about bail reform, we found ourselves responding, and we were really losing that battle. And so we wanted to get a sense of, what's the proactive messaging that could resonate with folks that are inclined to support bail reform, folks that turned out to protest a couple of years ago in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, folks that, by and large don't believe that prison is the answer. We wanted to hear what resonates with them, both messaging wise, but also in terms of the data. Is the data sticking? What's effective? What are the most effective talking points? And so, in order to develop, these more persuasive ways of communicating with our audiences, we engaged Goodwin Simon to conduct this project in order to understand specifically who our target audiences are, the complexities behind why New Yorkers hold certain beliefs about issues like money bail, pretrial detention, crime, safety, and violence, to investigate how our audiences are talking to each other about these key issues, and to help us think about which values are the most powerful framing tools. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the folks at Goodwin Simon, who are going to just get into more details behind the study methodology and, of course, the findings as well.
Thank you so much, Carl, and welcome everybody today. We're a small group, so please feel free to enter questions into the chat while we're going, or observations or comments, just thoughts. We can use the chat as kind of a running resource. And then we'll make sure that we have time for question and discussion as well. So if we can go to the next slide. Today, we are going to talk briefly about the Heartwired research approach, and how we think about research and messaging on topics that are socially complex and controversial. We're going to talk about the findings, the research findings from this work, as well as sharing recommendations. And I'm going to be co-presenting with my colleague, James Telesford, and our colleague, Sarah Knight is here as well. So thank you so much to Carl and Zoe. And let's dive into the next slide, please. So first of all, we are going to speak very briefly about Heartwired. This is a research approach and messaging approach that we've developed over the last few decades. And if you're interested in learning more about it, afterwards the webinar, we're happy to share more resources. So we've developed this approach to messaging specifically for socially controversial and emotionally complex topics, where we want our audience to change. We want them to feel, think, and behave differently than they do now. If we go to the next slide, what we've learned is that we developed this Heartwired approach because as we've worked on so many different issues, we found that our audience and our advocates often have this huge chasm between their worldviews. And our advocates see things one way, our audience see things in an entirely different way. Our advocates may think the problem is mass incarceration, racial profiling, police brutality, but our audience thinks the problem is subway shooters, grocery shooters, personal safety, gun homicides. And if you see the problem totally differently, that from different worldviews, then the solutions that we're proposing just don't make sense to our audience. Sometimes your advocates try to overcome this chasm by just kind of shouting louder and louder with their same messaging. And our audience is like, huh, I don't speak Italian. What are you talking about? You're not speaking my language. So we've learned that we need this heartwired research to help us bridge the chasm so we can really learn deeply about our audience's mindset, perspectives, emotions, so we can craft messaging that is effective, that's persuasive, that both meets them where they are, but also builds a bridge for them so that they can go on this change journey to become more supportive. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about how do we build that bridge? What is the pathway that enables change? So we use research to understand our audience's values. We listen deeply with empathy for our audience. And we work to identify that Venn diagram, that space where our audience's values overlap with our own. And that's the space that we're going to be building our messaging in. That's the place where we know that we can make progress and also be effective. We've learned that we need to have empathy for audience, and this can be hard, but we can't really generally connect with someone and persuade them if you don't have empathy for their point of view. Sometimes emotionally, it can feel like empathy is agreement, that somehow if you understand someone else's perspective, you're validating it, but it's not. Understanding does not equal agreement. You can understand where someone is coming from and understand the conclusions that they draw as a result of how they see the world and how they think, but not agree with the way where they're thinking or concluding. So that is really something that's important for us in this pathway to empathy is how we build this bridge. On the next slide, we talk about human beings as heartwired. And what that means in part is that we have these 5 heartwired factors that combine and collide to shape how we respond to the world around us, how we behave. And to develop effective messaging, we have to deeply understand these 5 factors: emotions, identity, beliefs, lived experiences, and values. If we don't understand people's emotions, what they're bringing to the topic, then we can't build messaging that is emotional, that connects with them. And we know we need emotional connection to leverage change. We also know that we need messaging rooted in shared values. We have to understand what those shared values are. Identity is important because we're all driven to see ourselves as being a good person. So we need to know what our audience's sense of identity is in terms of their topic, this topic. What do they think a good person would do around bail bond reform? And how can we help them see that what we're asking them to do is in fact in alignment with their sense of self, of being a good person? Beliefs are what we know to be true. Now, whether it is true or not, whether it is factually true or not, is not relevant here. It's just true for us. And so we need to understand what beliefs do people hold. And we also need to know about people's lived experiences. Lived experiences are not only what happens to us, but it's the meaning that we make from it. It's how we understand our world and our life. These are the 5 factors, the heartwired factors that we really need to understand about our audience that we dig into in the research. On the next slide, we'll share this concept about how human beings actually change their behavior. So we've learned over the decades that new information by itself does not change people's minds or behavior. We all have an existing worldview, and if information comes at us that just doesn't jive with our present belief system, we just reject it out of hand. And this happens on both the left and the right. It's not limited to either side of the ideological perspective. What we found is that to change behavior, we need to first generate a new emotional reaction in people. So when, as human beings, we have a new emotional reaction to a topic, something different than we've had before, our brain looks for a way to rationalize it and hold on to that feeling. So if we provoke that new emotional reaction and then we provide new information that's helpful, they can then hold on to that new feeling. Oh, that's why I feel that way. Okay, well, that makes sense. Now I can hold on to it. This enables them to then have a new attitude and change their behavior. So we know that this emotional messaging drives change. And one of the things we've seen on this issue is that our opposition is very effective at using emotional messaging, while our side tends to be more technical, more jargony, more abstract. So one of our challenges here is to develop messaging that has more of that emotional connection to it for our audience. On the next slide, we'll talk briefly about flawed mental templates. So a mental template is a set of images and associations that people have with something or someone they encounter out in the world, and it unconsciously impacts our emotional reactions to other people. So as human beings, we're not blank slates. We all have existing associations and connections that we make with anything we encounter out in the world. So in our research, we map the mental templates that people hold for all of the key ideas: crime, justice, incarceration, bail, and we understand we're working to understand what about their mental templates are flawed, because these inaccurate beliefs lead people to what we call broken reasoning chains. So if you think someone has been arrested and therefore is inherently dangerous because they've been arrested, then allowing them back out on the streets makes absolutely no sense to you. It's just a hard stop. You're not going to support that. So in the research, we dig into what are the flawed beliefs they hold, so that we know what are the things that we might need to correct in order for them to be able to be supportive of the approaches that we're advocating for. On the next slide, talk very briefly about our brains. So we have an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. Our downstairs brain gets triggered when we feel anger, anxiety, fear. And when our amygdala is triggered, it literally shuts down our upstairs brain. And that's where our high order thinking happens. That's where we are able to be reflective, to be empathetic, to be altruistic. Our opponents intentionally trigger our downstairs brain with their messaging. They drive anger and fear, and that makes it hard for people to have empathy, to be altruistic. Our job with our messaging is to actually calm people's amygdalas down so that they can get back to their reflective self. So that's one of the things that we do through our narrative messaging. So I'm going to just at this point turn it over to James to talk through some more specific things about the research. And again, we'll kind of go back and forth. And if you have questions, comments, thoughts, please, again, feel free to enter them into the chat, and we will talk about them after the presentation. James, over to you.
Thank you, Amy. So as Amy said, I'm going to provide a quick overview of some of the research and the way that we approached the research for this project. So our overall goals for this project were to really understand the audience mindset related to cash bail reform and pretrial detention in New York State. So we wanted to test different messaging strategies in support of reform, and also examine reactions to potential supporter messaging, and specifically in the context of opposition messaging, because we know that there is plenty of opposition messaging on this issue out there. Supporter messaging doesn't occur in a vacuum. We also want to investigate the messaging challenges and opportunities to build support for ending cash bail and pretrial detention in the state of New York. So how do we try to accomplish these goals? We started with a landscape phase to understand the messaging on both sides, so we could better understand the challenges and opportunities that might exist. We conducted 2 in-depth interviews, each of which were 2 hours, one of which was with a Black man from Flatbush in New York City, and the other was with a white woman from upstate New York in Lewis, to understand in depth their views and emotions, and test some initial messaging. Based on what we learned from that round of research, we refined and strengthened those messages and tested them in a multi-day online focus group, where people sign in each day to respond to questions and materials we pose. Today's presentation is about the findings from the online focus group, which included 25 people from across the state who were Black, Latinx, API, and white. And we excluded very liberal and very conservative people, and those who strongly favor or strongly oppose ending cash bail, because we really wanted to get at folks who were already persuadable on this issue. In addition, all of this research to date is completely qualitative in nature, and so while we can pull out some of the themes, and we have discovered a whole lot about the mindset around cash bail reform and pretrial detention, there is still much more to understand, and we really need much more research to understand and fully dig into how can we effectively craft messages to shift public opinion on this issue. And as you'll see in the end, while we've answered a lot of questions, we still have many more that remain. So in the focus groups, one of the things that we did is we tested messenger narratives, and the way that we do this is they're written narratives, but we attach an image to them because oftentimes what we find is that our audience sort of relates better to and connects more emotionally to narratives that have an image or feel like they have an actual person behind them. They feel like, you know, this person is actually telling me, so this is a real person that's actually telling me their story. The first narrative that we tested was somebody who was falsely accused of a crime, detained by the police. He got into, you know, a verbal confrontation with a store clerk, and the store clerk later said that it was a physical altercation, and the police came and arrested him. You know, in the end, he ended up losing everything, including his job, his family, and so this narrative was designed to highlight the harms of cash bail, of a cash bail system. The second narrative that we tested was a faith-based journey story, and journey stories are really about when an individual goes on you know, a path toward attitude change. So initially, they believed, you know, some of the opposition messaging, what the opposition believes, and then they experience something that sort of turns a light bulb on for them, and they sort of gradually start to change their position or their attitude change or their attitudes on the issue to be more supportive. And so essentially, you know, what that allows us to do is it allows us to model somebody who might be initially opposed to this, you know, making it sort of okay for them to change their mind on the issue. This one was specifically from somebody who, you know, had witnessed people who had been harmed by a cash bail system come and give stories to tell their own stories to her church. And she, you know, had also had other experiences and heard other stories in the news that made her realize that a cash bail system is extremely harmful. And then had heard other stories about the benefits of the reforms that were just implemented or that were implemented a couple of years ago. And then the final story we wanted to dig in, the final narrative was we wanted to dig into reactions to somebody who was accused of a violent crime and was detained. And in this one, it ended up that, you know, he did not receive the needed medical care in pretrial detention that he needed. I believe he had a seizure and ended up passing away. So this story is from the perspective of a mother who lost a child under that system. So what do we find? Some of the key findings. I'll talk a little bit about the audience mindset. So how folks entered the focus group, and then I'll turn it over to Amy to talk a little bit more about the detailed findings from the messaging materials that we tested. So when participants enter the study, many have deep concerns about the levels of rising crime in New York and in their own communities, or about what they see as the levels of rising crime in New York. And as Amy just mentioned, right, that means that their amygdala is already triggered, right? They're kind of in that downstairs brain. Most participants say that crime is either very much a problem or an extreme problem. They feel that things are, quote, starting to feel like the 80s again or early 90s again, which were, quote, darker times in New York, and that crime is getting worse at a significant rate. These concerns lead many participants to feel very unsafe on a deeply emotional level, you know, and you can kind of see that from the quote from the Latino male here on the right side of your screen in the gold bubble, where he says, just today in Brooklyn, the city where I am from, public safety was at an all-time low. 25 plus people got shot in public transportation. Bomb threats and general threats to the public seem to be a normal thing now. I'm so desensitized to hearing crimes, attacks, or violence that when I hear it, I go, just another day in NYC, but I know it shouldn't be this way. Prior to receiving any messaging, there are sort of varying degrees of knowledge about and support for bail reform. Many say they have heard very little about bail reform in New York. Those who have heard about it hold differing attitudes about the current status of it or what is happening in the state. Some who support bail reform prior to messaging are aware of some of the harms of the system. They feel reform will help ensure equal outcomes regardless of income level, and also believe that a cash bail system makes it hard to, quote unquote, get one's life back on track. You know, others want to make sure that dangerous criminals don't benefit from bail reform, so they think that reforms will lead to some kind of some folks taking advantage of the system in some way, particularly folks who are out to do others harm. And other participants see bail reform as a political tool that members of both sides use to their political benefit. So they see, the arguments and the messages that they hear in the media as too politically polarized and probably extreme on both ends. And what they're hearing in the media probably is not a reflection of real life. And then a few believe that a bail reform is an attempt to alleviate some of the pressures of what they see as the failed judicial or prison system, such as overcrowding or the high cost of having a lot of officers, watch over those who are in prison, a unionized workforce, essentially. Who do folks trust on this issue? There's a trust in a variety of sources. Folks say generally, I go to Google to find information on this. Some folks trust international news sources more than domestic news sources, simply because they see international news sources as having, no stake in the game, or, being more objective than domestic news sources might be. There is some trust in mainstream media outlets, larger national outlets like CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, of course, and local news outlets as well, like Fox 5 and the New York Daily News. There is more skepticism about social media sources, so like things that they hear on Facebook, skepticism of politicians who they feel might have a political agenda, and law enforcement who they see as just trying to keep their jobs. So all of those sources could be seen as biased sources. However, some participants do find these sources trustworthy and extremely important to hear from, particularly law enforcement and politicians, since those are the folks in charge of creating and enforcing the laws. And then after messaging, many participants say that the messenger that is missing from all of the materials are judges. They're really interested in hearing how judges specifically feel about the issue of bail reform in New York State. So Amy, I think I will turn that over to you to walk us through the messaging materials.
Great, thank you so much, James. So we tested messaging that we developed in response to what we learned in the landscape research and in the in-depth interviews. And so what are some of the things that we learned? So first of all, participants really understand and react emotionally in ways that are helpful to the harms of cash bail when those harms are described in simple, concrete terms, when they're presented in context with other information, and when they're presented in narrative or story form. So essentially when it's emotional. The context gives participants a way to remember details of harms, and it allows them to relate more emotionally, more viscerally to the issue, even if they personally have not experienced or know anyone who has experienced the harms. We also found that many of our participants feel very strongly about the importance of public safety and fairness in the criminal justice system. And they often perceive these values to be in conflict with each other. They're balancing their concern for public safety with a concern for the humane treatment of people who have been accused of committing crimes. So how they reconcile that difference in part depends on what kind of crime, the level of crime that is top of mind for them. When they're thinking, or aren't just thinking about those who've been accused of what they perceive to be minor or nonviolent crimes, participants tend to reconcile this conflict on the side of the accused rights. So even if they think that someone accused of a nonviolent crime is guilty, they also believe that the harms associated with pretrial detention are disproportionate. They're just too punitive when we describe those harms effectively. So they feel that people who have committed those kinds of crimes should not have to experience those harms of pretrial detention. On the other hand, when our audience is thinking top of mind about those who have been accused of what they perceive to be major or violent crimes, things like murder or child abuse are examples that participants have frequently raised in the focus group, then their concern shifts from protecting the rights of people who have been arrested to protecting themselves, their family members, their communities. They're more likely to feel that those who are accused of a violent crime are going to be a threat to the community if they are released. Go to the next slide. We found that many in our audience conflate pre-trial detention with guilt, believing that someone who's been arrested for a violent crime must therefore be guilty. This conflation is pronounced, and it interferes with support for ending cash bail and pre-trial detention when participants are thinking about those who've been accused of violent crimes. Their thinking is something like, yeah, if you've been accused of violent crime, where there's smoke, there's fire, you should be locked up in order to protect public safety. Then they have the sense of, even if there's just a 1% chance that you're going to go out and commit another violent crime, I want to make sure you're locked up. So That's kind of their mental template and their emotional state. This conflation is less likely to interfere with support when they're thinking about people who are accused of nonviolent crimes. And so it's really something that is more of an issue around violent crimes. So we found that messaging that highlights the bias and wrongdoing in the criminal justice system actually helps to address this conflation, kind of breaks up their broken reasoning chain, their flawed reasoning chain. Some of our participants already understand and view the system as inherently flawed. So anytime our messaging highlights that the system makes mistakes, it helps to minimize this conflation, this belief that if you've been arrested, you therefore should be behind bars. Messaging that places a spotlight on disproportionate punishments is also effective and connects with their shared value of fairness. So examples that were very effective from our messaging, including somebody who was accused losing their family, losing their job, losing their housing because of being in pretrial detention, or if the bail amount is just set too high, or if the stay in jail before the trial is lengthy. So those kinds of harms were very concrete and vivid for people and felt disproportionate. Messaging around that was effective. We'll go to the next slide. So participants also really valued treating each person as an individual. So as we shared stories, we shared information embedded in the stories, it really came up that they don't want the same charges applied blindly across cases. So there's a view that each case is unique, different circumstances around both the accused and their potential crimes. So they view providing judges with discretion to be something that's good, that's a benefit to both the accused and supportive of public safety. And there's a sense that this judges having discretion can strike an appropriate balance between fairness and public safety. At the same time, there is some mistrust of judges, and there's some concern that judges make racially biased or politically motivated decisions when they're setting bail. So messaging that we tested about judges ignoring laws that require them to consider an accused income, to consider their ability to pay cash bail, helps create some doubt about the objectivity of the judges, and that helped in terms of building support for ending cash bail. So related to this, messaging that includes details about the life and circumstances of the accused is very compelling. It helps to have people not just be like a stereotype of somebody like, oh, well, he's a criminal or she's a criminal, but to see this person in the context of their community and family really helped to build support. Go to the next slide. We found that people really would like to have, they strongly desire a fair justice system. They recognize a lot of the justice system is not fair. And they feel that financial or racial bias is wrong and that it's credible to them. They see it, they understand it. They do want people to be treated fairly and humanely, regardless of race, regardless of ability to pay cash bail. And they believe that everyone should have an equal chance at freedom. So messaging that highlights the costs of pretrial detention is particularly compelling. They feel that the cost is evidence of government misuse of funds or waste. They're also motivated to put their tax dollars to better use through community investments. So cost around that is helpful. There's also significant support for addressing the root causes of crime through making community investments. However, there is skepticism that these kinds of investments will help reduce violent crimes, which many feel are more personal in nature. So some feel like some people have some of our participants had firsthand experience living in areas that are more prone to violent crime, and they felt that the kind of violence interrupters were ineffective. Others did not have that experience and didn't really have a point of view around that. But what we found was that support for community investment does not conflict with support for pretrial detention, meaning that participants don't see these as mutually exclusive. They feel that you should be investing, that it is important to address root causes, and that is potentially going to reduce violence in the long term. But in the near term, they also see that pretrial detention can keep quote unquote dangerous criminals off the streets. Go to the next slide. Many of our participants feel that families of accused people are innocent victims of the criminal justice system, and messaging that talks about the emotional and financial toll of pretrial detention on the family of the accused was often very compelling. However, a cautionary or just something to be aware of as we're crafting these kinds of narratives, that some participants discuss the important role of personal responsibility and the fact that the person who committed the crime, should have thought about their family and kept in mind the impact on their family before they committed the crime. So it's something to be aware of as we construct narratives. So many believe that those who've been accused of violent crimes are more likely to reoffend once they're released without cash bail, more likely to cause further harm to the community, and less likely to show up to their court dates once they're released. So those are some of the beliefs that they have. So some believe it's not just enough to show up for court once they've been released. They also want to know what kind of contributions the person accused of a crime is making to society once they're released. So what are you doing with your time when you're out there? You have this chance to be back out there. What are you doing with yourself? So messaging that puts the accused in the context of their communities and shows them with their families, shows them at work, shows them doing things that are contributing to community betterment or life is something that's really helpful and compelling. Go to the next slide. So we found that facts and statistics on the low number of rearrests and on the high percentage of people who show up for a court, even without cash bail, was really compelling. And so those are important pieces of information, and embedding them in stories, as we'll talk more about, helps people to really remember them and retain them much better. At the same time, some participants felt like the statistics were probably overblown, or they feel like they don't believe them for people accused of violent crime. They think someone accused of violent crime is definitely going to flee and not show up for their court date. So most participants find narrative stories to be powerful and compelling, the ones that we crafted and tested. And the stories really provide our audience an opportunity to connect on an emotional level, and they provide context for the statistics that show the harm of cash bail. So many of our participants say they were more persuaded by the stories than by statements alone. Stories showing the benefits of bail reform that were emotionally compelling were also very persuasive for people. So we'll go to the next slide. So some of the information that does help build support when it's delivered in narratives, when it's delivered in an emotional context, is that the high percentage of people who are arrested who show up for their court date, it's surprising and calming for many. As well as learning about the low percentage of people who are rearrested. Specific statistics and details instead of generalized statements are helpful. Generalized statements, participants kind of viewed as like, well, what's the facts? Where's the source of that? Lack solid evidence. The broad statements were less helpful, but information, again, in the context of story, specific facts was very helpful for people. Messages about the amount of money government spends on pretrial detention is compelling, and it aligns with audience concerns that already exist about financial waste, government efficiency, and so those are helpful. Specifics detailing the disproportionate punishment, such as high bail amounts, are also compelling for people. The fact that people who are wealthy can just pay it and get out is disturbing. Discussing the pressure to plead guilty just to move the process along for some participants, it really makes them outraged. They just see that as unfair. And when you describe the situation vividly with personal stories, they see it, they feel it, they understand how that happens, and they think it's really wrong. And then highlighting the emotional and financial toll on the accused family was also very effective at generating new emotional reaction and fostering audience empathy. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to James to continue walking us through our findings.
Thank you, Amy. So one of the things that we think it's important to do is try to assess the overall effect of our messaging. And remember, our messaging takes place in the context of opposition messaging as well, right? We expose our participants to both supporter messaging and opposition messaging. Both before and after, so we do a pre and post test, any messaging, we ask them a question so that we can assess their movement by the end of the focus group. So on day one, before they're exposed to any messaging materials or any information about bail reform at all, we get their baseline level of attitudes. And that is what you see on the orient sheet of the slide on the bottom row here on the initial row. And what we asked them is, there has been some talk lately about different issues related to cash bail reform and pretrial detention. Please tell us how you personally feel using a scale of 0 to 10. Choose a number that shows where you are personally. Where would you place yourself in between these two ends? Are you closer to one end or the other? And then we ask them, we show them this continuum from 0 to 10. And the anchors are either, basically pure supporter or pure opposition statement. So On the 0, we have the supporter statement. Keeping people in jail while they await trial is unjust and unnecessary. Being detained like this can cause real harm, leading to people losing their jobs and homes, being unable to care for children and loved ones, or becoming so despairing that they commit suicide. And then on the far extreme and on the 10 anchor, we should not allow people accused of committing crimes back on the street. Keeping potentially dangerous people detained while they await trial helps keep us all safe. And then in the table below those, you can sort of see the frequency or the count of people who place themselves under each section, right? And to just sort of briefly summarize, this purple point here is roughly the midpoint. And then so anything below that we would sort of classify as supporter, anything above that we would sort of classify as or we would classify as anti-bail or supportive of reform. Anything above that we would classify as pro-bail or against reform. And so what you see is, initially prior to messaging, there's roughly an equal split. The distribution is relatively, dispersed between 0 and 10, right? Roughly the same number of people are against bail reform as support reform. However, what you see when on day 4, we ask the same exact question, and what you can see is pretty substantial positive movement, right? Whereas initially we had 10 people who were against reform. By day 4, after receiving all of the messaging materials, we're left with only really 4 people who are against bail reform, and 0 who are at the 10 point. And here we've picked up on the pro side, or those who support reform, we've picked up 3 people. And again, these are just sort of preliminary results because they're qualitative, but they're very, very encouraging. Of course, we need much more research, including quantitative research, to make sure or to confirm what we're seeing here, and to further unpack what specifically about our messages are effective. And then here, this is just measuring, these just show you the same exact, this shows you the same exact table, but broken down by race and gender. And what you can see is that, regardless of race, regardless of gender, we also constructed a table by location or geographic region in the state. And what you can see is remarkably consistent results, regardless of which demographic that we're looking at. So this messaging seems to be effective across a sort of wide audience of demographics. Importantly, not only do we ask them, to place themselves in between those two continuums to assess their baseline and final attitudes, we also ask them to give us some of the reasons or the motivation behind their placement, both on day 1 and on day 4. So on day 1, we ask them, place yourself on this continuum, and then, why did you place yourself there? And then on day 4, here is this continuum again. You might remember it. Did you place yourself somewhere different? If so, basically what's the reason for that? And so on day 1, you can sort of see, so here are, 2 participants who shifted from less supportive to being more supportive. The participant on the left on day 1 was really focused, prior to messaging, was really focused on accountability and deterrence. So this person says, quote, "I feel that individuals need to be held responsible for their actions. Sitting in jail can be one way to deter these individuals from committing future crimes. If criminals can just sit at home and await trial, they may have increased motivation to commit more crime." Then on day 4, we, again followed up, asked them the same question after messaging, and now he's really focused on fairness for the accused, right? He says, based on some of the readings, which is the messaging materials that we constructed, it is not fair that certain people sit behind bars for minor crimes because they cannot post bail. And keep in mind, right, this is a relatively conservative Democrat, white male in his 30s. On the right, we see a similarly supportive shift on day 1. Again, focus on accountability. "I believe if you've committed a crime, you deserve to face the repercussions of the decisions you made. Oftentimes, people feel they are above the law and can get away with things over and over." And then on day 4, it's really, again, the focus on the harms of a cash bail system. "My opinion has shifted slightly more towards not keeping people in jail until trial because reading firsthand experiences with that really opened my eyes to the issue." And this is also, a liberal API woman in her 30s from upstate. So I'll hand it over to Amy and to walk us through some of the recommendations that we found, that we uncovered from this research.
Thank you so much. So if we can go to the next slide, James. So first of all, we found that it's really important to acknowledge the importance of public safety and feeling safe in one's community. So participants, as we talked about in the mindset, they're feeling unsafe right now. They're concerned about rising crime, about gun violence, the randomness of things like subway shootings, grocery store shootings. And so if our messaging doesn't acknowledge or understand their concerns, then they're just not able to hear our message. They think we don't get it. And so there's some acknowledgement that has to happen in our messaging. We also, another really important recommendation is to show, don't tell. So what we mean by that is use stories that describe the harm and then embed in those stories statistics that are that back up, that flesh out the range of the impact. So you're telling a personal story that's emotionally compelling, it's memorable, and then you embed in it statistics. People hold on to that information. They retain it when it comes to them in emotional context. So they think about, so for example, one thing people thought about is, well, if you're arrested and you get out, you're not going to show up for court. We had a story where the person did keep their job, they were able to continue on with their life and then go to court. And in that, we embedded a fact, I think it was 98% of people show up for their trial. Later on in the focus group, people referenced back to that as credible and they remembered it. And in part, it's because it was embedded in an emotional story. So we know that it's important to highlight the harms of cash bail and pretrial detention in clear, simple language. Most people do not understand or know what the harms are. They're just not aware of it. And so we can't say it often enough. There's a lot of jargon and abstract ideas on our side, technical terms that our side uses that are just meaningless to our audience. They just don't understand what those are. And so it's really important that we use simple language that is connecting with people. It's important for us to offer alternative solutions. If we just are against something, but we're not for something, people don't sort of know what we stand for, and it's important for them to hear what it is that we stand for as well. So offering alternative solutions that support public safety, including community investments that are designed to address the root causes of crime, are important and helpful. We also want to include specifics about the disproportionate bail amounts and time in jail, impact to career, to livelihood, the emotional and financial toll for families, all of those kinds of, not just the harms themselves, but the disproportionate harms and the disparate harms are really important. Highlighting the fallibility and flaws in the criminal justice system, including false accusations, biased judges. Those are things that help people to just realize, like, oh, the fact that someone has been arrested does not mean that they're guilty. It helps them to disconnect that, makes them more skeptical, which makes them more concerned then about protecting the impact on the person who's been accused. We also messaging that connects with our shared desire for fairness and including details that highlight racial and financial bias in the system. Again, the idea that people could buy themselves out if they were wealthy, while people who were everyday people had to sit in jail was really struck people as wrong. Showing that individuals have been charged with a crime in the context, showing people who have been charged with a crime in the context of their families and community. So talking about them as connected to their families and communities rather than just having them be kind of an isolated person was really important and helpful. And then underscoring the costs and amounts that the government spends or wastes on pretrial detention. Those are all really compelling messaging components. And I'm going to turn it back to you, James, to talk about some future research questions, and then we'll have a few minutes for discussion, Q&A reactions.
Thank you, Amy. So as you've seen, we've learned a lot about how to make progress on this issue. And the results of all of our qualitative research are extremely encouraging, but we're left with many more questions, and we need much more research to dig into some of these issues. So this list is definitely representative, but it is certainly not exhaustive. I'm sure that there are many more questions that you all can even think of yourselves that we have not yet that we have yet to dig into. So the first question is, what other stories of harm or hope will be compelling to our audience? We've uncovered a few of them in our research, but what other ones will be particularly compelling to folks? What non-carceral solutions does our audience feel will effectively address crime and lead to safer communities? So the ones that we tested, violence interrupters, were not particularly persuasive to our audience, but they were supportive of community investments, right? And so what other non-carceral solutions will our audience also support? In order to build support for non-carceral solutions to violence, do we need to provide evidence-based examples of existing programs already in operation, right? So oftentimes our audience latches on to and is moved by programs or policies that are already in place in other locations that have proven successful or effective on the issue that they're thinking of. And so, might that be similarly effective here? What are the community investments that our audience will support to help address the root causes of crime? How can our messaging more effectively calm audience concerns about violent crime and their fear of quote unquote repeat offenders? We see that the opposition has really leaned into, bail reform has basically caused people to get out on the streets and, commit more crime immediately, right? What they call repeat offenders. And that resonates to some extent with our audience. So how can our messaging more effectively calm those concerns? In order to build support for ending pretrial detention, how do we disrupt the prevalent assumption that accusations of committing violent crime means someone is guilty? Remember, our audience seems less likely to give the benefit of the doubt to those accused of committing violent crimes because they feel like if there's even a minimal percentage chance that they could get out and commit more harm to somebody, they don't want that to happen. They err on the side of safety and also sort of conflate that with guilt, right? They assume that the person has committed the violent crime that they're accused of. What other messengers are credible and persuasive to our audience? And can incorporating redemption or contribution frames in our messaging help calm audience concerns and build support? So what we've seen sometimes in other areas is that when somebody in the narrative, has learned a lesson or has redeemed themselves in some way, or is seen as quote unquote making a contribution to their community in some way, that those can often help calm concerns about things like reoffenders or folks who are just taking advantage of the system and things like that. So can those be similarly effective and help build support for reform? And I think I will turn it back to Amy to lead us through some of the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, James. And I think we can drop a slide and just talk. I don't think we need to be in spotlight mode. I'm wondering if folks, I see Abigail, Deborah, Emily, Justin, if you have thoughts, comments, questions, we'd love to hear them either out loud or through the chat. I see Justin. Okay, and Justin, do you want to say this out loud, or I'm not sure with this, if I can just read this. I recently noted that media outlets, including those widely considered liberal, have demonstrated a bias on their reporting of public safety issues, leaning more towards the perspective of law enforcement. Definitely, and we saw that in our messaging audit that we referenced that we did, where there was just a clear bias around that. How can nonprofits and other organizations message effectively in criminal justice reform in the face of this bias? So it's a great question, and I welcome Carl and Zoe and others to share ideas on this too. But a lot of it is about how the kinds of stories that you put out there, the personal stories, and how you put them out there, because the reporters themselves hold the same flawed mental templates and beliefs that our audience holds. They also are human beings. They also are conflating arrest with guilt. They also have heightened anxiety about safety, public safety, personal safety, violent crime. And so a lot of the things that we need to do to calm our audience, we actually need to do to calm reporters. And that could potentially help to make them be more effective and open in terms of how they are reporting on these perspectives. But I'd love to hear other thoughts as well.
I think that's it. I think that one thing that the other side does well is that they're constantly putting out messaging, even when there isn't a bill moving or a specific legislative proposal. Whereas our side, when things are quiet, we sort of just leave it alone. Like we're afraid to, shake the bottle or whatever, or shake things up a bit. But I think that, we do still need to put out, to stay on the offense and continue to put out our message, because we never know when there's going to be an attack.
And Carl, just to build on that, a strikingly large proportion of people really had heard very little about bail bond reform in New York, even though they live in New York and they're relatively informed people in other ways. So I think you can't deliver your messaging too early and too often to break through, so that you have that much more awareness and understanding of the harms that it causes on communities. And Deborah, I see you wrote, I'm glad to hear your emphasis on empathy as a necessary first step in helping others to change their point of view. Very much so, because we know that we need to, in order for people to change, they have to have this emotional connection, emotional reaction. And when they don't have that, then they don't have empathy. And empathy is a precursor to altruism. Like, in order to be able to act on behalf of other people, you do need to have empathy. So it's really important to develop messaging that enables that empathy to be present for people. Other comments, thoughts, questions, reactions? Carl, do you want to do any closing words?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us. We did record this webinar, so everyone will get the recording. We're also going to send out some materials. We're going to send out a version of the PowerPoint that was presented today, as well as a tip sheet. And so look out in your inboxes for that information. And, I think I alluded to this in the beginning, but we really see this as being the first step in a longer project that we're committed to at Envision Freedom, around looking at narrative change and figuring out how do we change the narrative and culture around criminalization and incarceration, by empathizing with people and by allowing our message to meet people where they're at, while also pushing them to shift their beliefs. And so, this is very much a first step. We're hoping to undergo, additional phases of this project, funding permitting, of course. Yeah, we're just super grateful for the team at Goodwin-Simon for, being able and willing to work with us on this. And I want to give a special thanks to my colleague Zoe, who conceived this project 2 years ago. Really, like, one of the first times I met her, she presented this idea, and it really was a great idea, and it's something that our movement very much so needed. So thanks so much, everyone, for getting on.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.